What are the interesting conjunctions of psychoanalysis and other theoretical formations which enable us to do some interesting pieces of critical work? Making that comment then enables me to introduce one of the chapters that I wrote, and that was very much an attempt to engage at some length a really remarkable and somewhat undervalued paper written by the novelist, the South African novelist, J.M. Coetzee. So, a lot of people know Coetzee, Nobel-winning author for some of his novels, quite rightly so. Many people know him for some of his literary writings, his literary critique as well, rightly so. But a really important essay he writes in 1991 is called The Mind of Apartheid. And in that paper, which, to my mind, I think if that was the only thing he did, that would be pretty remarkable. He does a lot of things. Unbeknownst to him, or maybe he does know, but he's working on this project, The Mind of Apartheid, towards the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. And one of the questions that motivates this paper is how to understand the madness of apartheid, how to understand, you could say, the madness, the obsessionality of white supremacism. And he tackles the question in a very sophisticated way. And he tackles the question by employing, to great effect, a Freudian frame of analysis. And because he's a literary scholar, and again, we have these questions of what kind of discourse, psychological discourse, we should utilize in thinking about racism, he uses a literary mode of engagement. And because he wants to use a literary mode of engagement, that's his training, that's his expertise, he turns to the writings of a key apartheid ideologue, a man by the name of Cronje, Geoffrey Cronje. And he starts reading through all of these tracts, these sociological texts that Geoffrey Cronje produces basically as a validation and justification of white supremacist ideology. And in so doing, Coetzee starts to do something which is quite psychoanalytic. He uses and traces the language very carefully to see where there's moments when the language folds in on itself and starts to give forth implications that the author doesn't quite intend. Nevertheless, the reason I mention this here is that at the same time that Coetzee is writing this paper, which is like a really long, extensive piece of research, which clearly involved a concerted project of reading. This is the same time when the Slovene school and Slavoj Žižek and various others are really trying to utilize Lacanian theory as a mode of ideology critique. So, The Sublime Object of Ideology comes out in 1989, and Coetzee is working on some of these challenges in his paper. And his paper is very much about how do we think apartheid, the madness of apartheid, in response to ideological formations and also predominant theories of ideology at the time. So what I try to do in that paper is to say, well, how can we overlap these approaches? Coetzee comes up with a question there. He says, how do we understand the madness of apartheid? It's a question that's still relevant today. We could say in terms of maybe slightly differently, what is the madness of white supremacism, or what's the madness of, and I'm a little bit cautious of the words I'm using here, just because recently I've got into a little bit of hot water on Twitter for making certain critiques. But essentially you could say, what is the pathology, or what is the structure, or what are the psychical dynamics that underlie something like an obsessional form of whiteness? And for those of you who don't know the paper, I'd really recommend it, because his application of a Freudian register, focusing on notions of displacement, focusing on notions of ambivalence, of compulsion, it's really an excellent piece of Freudian analysis. But without getting bogged down in those details, right towards the end of the paper, he's still trying to get an answer to this question. And there's really two questions you could say. One is, what drives this economy of white racism? Why would white people do something like this? Why does apartheid continue, even in some respects, when it would be contrary to the economic interests of a white electorate? So he wants to know about that. And the tentative answer he comes up with is one of the things that seems to have driven this ideological machine and the psychology of a kind of obsessional whiteness was the phantasmatic figment, the prospect of a kind of, he puts it in these terms, a fantasy reward or phantasmatic reward of whiteness itself. Intriguingly, he's not able to fully develop that answer. He gets there. And in other words, one of the things that's important about this is he's suggesting that racism is not merely structural. Okay, it's not merely a factor of the momentum of economic discursive structure of privilege and dominance. It is that too, but there's something else that is required. There's something else about a libidinal investment, about a fantasy, about some kind of reward, or some kind of, in Lacanian terms, a fantasy object that I need to obtain and hold for myself. So that's one.
Eric, I just want to interrupt just for a moment. Because I think for many people, or at least I certainly see a lot of people discuss it in this way, that it's often thought of that racism and even the structure of apartheid, or in the United States, the persistence of various complicated structures of racism up through the civil rights era, it's often thought of as some more or less a kind of structure of scapegoating, that there's a kind of like, and what I really get very strongly from a lot of the writing here and from the Lacanian analytic is that what you're pursuing is a sort of a deeper persistence, the way in which the structure of race and racism persists beyond simply looking for like a figure to blame. That's a part of it, but there's something else going on, what you're talking about with the recuperating of a perceived loss of castration, etc. I just wanted to emphasize that to be something to draw out further for the audience so that they can understand the distinction.
That's helpful, because one of the, I'd mentioned that there were kind of two questions, and one of the questions that Coetzee is interested in is that at a certain period of ideology theory, the notion of structuralist theories of ideology would, we have to be careful, but don't really place much emphasis on the role of an individual, and then certainly don't place a lot of emphasis on the role of an individual psyche. So Coetzee asks a whole series of questions then. Well, if ideology and racist ideology is this virus-like spread of ideas that has this kind of momentum that continues to grow, and there's something interesting in that theory, how do we understand the role of singular subjects in the perpetuation of racist ideology? So the paper is a kind of mediation on these things. And I suppose, yes, that question of what Lacanian theory offers us here comes in a kind of oblique way in Coetzee's argument, because it seems that something like fantasy and an engagement of what one presumes the socioeconomic frame, the big other of this society means, and what it gives for me and what gives me value becomes very important. Put more simply, I think part of what Coetzee is saying is that we need to engage with the mechanisms of fantasy as well in the understanding of ideology. And there's certainly periods in a structuralist theory of ideology where that vocabulary of individual desires, of fantasies, is just not part of the picture. Incidentally, and I'll try and simplify as I go on, incidentally, one of the other questions that Coetzee raises in a very provocative but very useful way, in a way that's echoed and preempted by Fanon actually, is to say, and I think we need to keep these questions in mind, that racism itself can be seen as a form of desire. Okay, those two terms don't often fit well in our everyday thinking. How can racism be a form of desire? But it's certainly the case for moments in Fanon, and certainly the case for Coetzee. And when we start to apply the thinking of desire and racism together, one starts to get a sense of the fecund, ongoing perpetuation of racism, which is, as desire in a sense starts to feel like it has no end. So that's the complicated part. Let me then just quickly say a little bit about how this all applies to Lacanian theory and why Lacanian theory is useful. And I'll try and make things a lot more straightforward. There's multiple concepts that Sheldon and I have alluded to that find their way into the book and that are useful, and I think do a kind of critical work that other theories don't allow. And part of the fact that that happens, I think, is something to do with the fact that psychoanalysis is born in the clinic, right? So the concept of jouissance, this highly paradoxical notion that there may be some gratification in the extreme, in the painful. This is a concept, I think, that we see exemplified time and time again in the clinic, and I think it becomes very illuminating and useful and brought into the domain of social theory. So here we go. This is essentially the point I'm trying to make. One concept that I think we find in Lacan that we don't find elsewhere Maybe we see some intimations or shadows of it in some other places, but I don't think we find it deployed and thought in quite the same way as the notion of the big other. The big other, just to give a little bit of background for people who are less familiar with these ideas, the big other is a kind of notion which suggests that in human societies and individual human subjectivity, there's often some kind of point of appeal, a point of reference, a locus of the truth beyond my own subjectivity. What that also means is that if I'm embroiled with an argument with Sheldon about whatever, we can point to some, whatever it is, Lacanian expert, some Lacanian text, and try and find an answer. Okay, so the idea here is that the notion of the big other, it can't be reduced to simply a singular subjectivity. In fact, the big other as point of appeal or locus of truth or treasury of signifier, all of these are terms that Lacan gives us to try and understand this concept, is what grounds and underpins the very possibility of intersubjective interaction. Now, let's build on that a little bit. What that means, and Sheldon has already pointed us in this direction, is that you can never have in Lacanian theory an idea of a merely intrapsychic type of subjectivity, or intrapsychic dynamics are never merely a depth psychology or an internalized psychology. Why? Because the very words, the concepts that I use to formulate and express myself always come from the treasury of the signifier, the big other. And of course, we know Lacan often brings Hegel into play to say that the desire of the subject is always the desire of the other. So if we take that seriously, that means that there's no such thing as an isolated or insulated intrasubjective subject. Rather, the subject is always stretched between reference to something like this big other, this point of appeal, this treasury of the signifier, and we can also say this reference point or treasury of ideological values. Now, this is helpful to us when we think about racism, because if the subject is always involved in the question, the phantasmatic question that doesn't necessarily need to be actually literally spoken, what does the other want? What must I be? Who should I be in this place? What does the other want of me? What's special about me? How can I engender the love of the other? This is a kind of matrix of fantasy. If that is the ongoing question, then we start to see that what Lacan and Lacanian theory does, I think, is a kind of partial breakdown of this separation that we get in so many theories of individual and society, of subject and the symbolic order, for that matter, the psychological and the sociological. The big other is the kind of indivisible mediator that hangs in between these things. And then we can say, just to build on that, and then I'll relate it back to racism, there can be no subject, there can be no individual subject without the big other, because the big other is the language, the big other is the reference point of desires that makes that subject viable. And similarly, we can also say that there is no big other without the subject, because the big other is the subject supposed to know, the reference point of authority. The big other is the transferential subject supposed to know that the individual subject believes in, and thus, in a sense, engenders. Now, apologies for all that theory, but perhaps you can see where this is going. Why this is important is you could say that merely psychological theories of racism are not in and of themselves enough, right? And we can do important work within the remit of what we could call psychological or ego-based theories of racism. Even in Fanon, of course, we see a reference to the use of the mirror stage, and we see that kind of those type of dynamics of racism. But we can say that maybe a psychological theory, an ego-centered theory of ego dynamics, projection, projective identification, to use some of the Kleinian terminology, is not all we need. We need something more than that. You could say, okay, good. We also need a sociological or social political or discursive theory of racism. And yes, we can see moments in Lacan where we have that as well. In other words, you could say, what is the big other if not that kind of socio-historical set of values, that kind of structural impetus of racism? So we can use bits of Lacan to try and inform both of those levels, a psychological, ego-focused dimension of racism, as well as a more sociological, historical level of racism. But the importance of the notion of the big other is that it's the thing that's indivisibly between those. And what that then means is that in Lacanian theory, racism should be seen as existing at those levels, but maybe part of what makes it so persistent, so effervescent in some respects, is that it is also caught in between, in a kind of dialogue between those levels. So just to bring it down and concretize it as much as possible, if we're saying that the elementary matrix of fantasy in Lacanian theory is, what do you want from me? And again, it's not necessarily a conscious question. Sometimes it is, but it's an enacted, lived proposition more than it is a kind of word proposition. That means then that racism can be constantly recycled, reiterated at the level of the subject's engagement with what they are hoping to find as an answer to what the big other means for me. And if it exists at that level, Lacan is both giving us the resources to think psychological levels of racism, sociological, historical levels of racism, but also the fact that racism exists as precisely a kind of ongoing dialogue between these two things, whereby the subject is trying to find out what they are, what their desire is with reference to this big other. So to conclude then, I know that was a lot. What I think is useful then is when we read Coetzee's essay, one question we could ask is the big other racist? And certainly in the apartheid context, we would have to say, yes, the big other is racist. And we can apply that question to multiple geographical and historical contexts. Maybe the answers will be slightly different. But the further impact of that, and this is where the psychoanalytic angle is important, it's not good enough just to say that the social structure itself is racist. That's hugely important. But how is meaning engendered, fantasies engendered, and certain types of rewards engendered for the maintenance of certain types of identities? And I think that's what Coetzee has a basic intuition of when he says that the white electorate in this crucial final period of apartheid was still hanging on to this idea of some phantasmatic rewards that are enraptured in and wrapped up in whiteness itself, in the Afrikaner folk. This idea is important, and it goes back, I think, also to Andrew's question. Racism is not merely structural, it is that too, but it must also be viewed in terms of the transferential relationship and phantasmatic investments that individual subjects have to those structures. And it's in that process of being recycled, reiterated, rethought, and phantasmatically deployed as an answer. Whiteness is my special fantasy object, for example. And that special fantasy object is given a name for Lacan. I sometimes jokingly refer to it as a kind of libidinal treasure, but it's the thing that's more me than me. And it holds out the salvation that all those moments of lack, of inability, of impossibility, Lacanian moments of the real, that don't quite make sense. But as long as I can hold on to this phantasmatic element, and in Coetzee's paper, and I think still today in many respects, part of that answer, and we should be more textured and careful and historically precise when we venture an answer to that question, but it certainly seems within the domain of white racism, there is some phantasmatic object, some object A, that is very, very precious to a given white community, and they will do almost anything to hold on to that. And I'll say one final sentence. One of the most interesting research topics linked to some of what we've done here for me is to ask questions about white anxiety. I paid a pretty heavy price for doing that, but it's an important question. And I actually do not mean any disrespect to any white colleagues, or actually I don't mean an attack on whiteness. It's often how I'm read. But what I'm saying is it's tremendously frightening to be in a situation where your phantasmatic object is threatened with being taken away with some kind of castration. And one thing I have learned about this experience of even suggesting such things is people act extremely aggressively and very defensively if you are to suggest such a thing. And I'm not going to attack anyone for those kinds of comments, but I think it is a case in point of just exactly how precious those phantasmatic rewards and investments can be in a racial identity.